innovative educator, and global leader in sustainable development. He serves as the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University and also was the former director of the Earth Institute at the same university. Mr. Sachs has authored and edited numerous books and has received 38 honorary doctorates. I would like to call upon you, sir, to share some knowledge with all our students.
Thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be with the IIM Gaia. I hope I can visit in person sometime to your beautiful campus and your beautiful region. My responsibility in the United Nations on behalf of the UN Secretary General is to try to promote solutions to achieving the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So that is the big puzzle that I work on and that I try to promote through a global network of universities in the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. As you know, or I hope you know, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are a set of guideposts for achieving sustainable development, meaning increased economic prosperity, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability. So the 17 Sustainable Development Goals include targets of ending extreme poverty, ending all forms of hunger and undernutrition, ensuring universal access of all children to school, universal health coverage, universal access of all households to basic infrastructure, including safe water and sanitation, electrification, and digital connectivity. Social justice, in that no groups should be left behind, neither women nor minority groups nor other disadvantaged groups. Inequality should be kept to a relatively low level, which is goal SDG 10. And all of the major environmental crises that we are facing, human-induced climate change, loss of biodiversity, pollution, should be addressed. Goal SDG 12, for example, is about reducing pollution through recycling and reuse and improved materials. SDG 13 is about confronting climate change. SDG 14 is about protecting marine ecosystems. And SDG 15 is about protecting terrestrial ecosystems. It's no secret that the world, in fact, almost every country in the world, is off track on some or most of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the SDGs set a number of targets for each of these big objectives. These targets are generally set for the
This meeting is being recorded.
Generally set for the year 2030, and countries, especially their national governments, are to report on progress towards the SDGs when they make presentations to other governments at the United Nations in the so-called voluntary national reviews. In 2023, we'll have a mid-period review of the Sustainable Development Goals at the UN, because it will be halfway between their adoption at the end of 2015 and the date for their target completion in 2030. Well, we're way off track. The world is not achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are countless reasons for that. But the global disruptions are important parts of this failure. We have the of course, the massive disruption from the COVID-19 pandemic. We have now the disruption from the war in Ukraine and all of its geographical spillover worldwide, because we have a regime of international sanctions, for example, against Russia that is disrupting the world economy. We have the geopolitical tensions between the United States and China, which are making it very hard to achieve any kind of cooperation. And we have a failure of the rich countries to provide the kind of financing assurances that developing countries need to confront challenges such as climate change. Climate change is a very vivid example of a global ill caused mainly by the rich countries, but the rich countries show no responsibility or solidarity with the rest of the world, and so do not even follow through on promises that they have made repeatedly to provide financing for energy transformation and for adaptation to climate change. And we know that the crises are getting worse and worse. In India, many parts of the country hit record temperatures now almost every year, 40 degrees C, 45 degrees C. And next door in Pakistan, today there is an astounding flood that came from the excess precipitation of this summer's monsoons, which were almost 200% above the 30-year average rainfall. And just yesterday, a group of scientists provided an attribution study showing that human-induced climate change was a big part of that increased precipitation. Of course, there are other more local factors as well that account for the damage of the flooding, such as deforestation in the upper Himalayan region. We're seeing these kinds of ecological calamities everywhere. We're seeing that progress against poverty has been stopped or even reversed because of the pandemic, because of the war in Ukraine, because of the sanctions regime, because of the lack of appropriate international financing. So this is not a pleasant picture at all. What I am myself advocating in the UN system and in the G20 process, which India will host in 2023, so I think that that is a real opportunity, is a breakthrough in redesigning international financing for sustainable development, so that developing countries, including India and other countries at similar levels of income per capita, are able to avail themselves of larger flows of capital to make critical investments to achieve sustainable development. I interpret the Sustainable Development Challenge as largely an investment challenge, but a complex investment challenge, because it's not only investment by business, but it's also investment by governments. And governments lack the capacity, the fiscal space to carry out these investments. Think of Bihar's very limited budget, or the lack of ability of the union government to provide adequate financing for your region for critical services and critical infrastructure. So this is a general problem of how to design and finance an appropriate scale of investments in critical areas. I identify myself and try to quantify 6 major areas of investment. The first is investment in education, because while that's counted as a cost in the budget, it's really an investment. In fact, it's the single most important investment that any society makes. So are the children in Bihar getting a decent education? Are they in school? Can they stay in school? Can girls stay in school all the way through upper secondary completion or even higher? Usually the answer is no, or certainly not reliably so. But this I regard as a fundamental investment that the public sector has fundamental responsibility to achieve. The second investment area is in healthcare and health systems, because this is also an area of fundamental importance for human well-being, but also deeply underinvested. For me, it's been one of the great puzzles of my life why India spends so little on public health, because the public should be demanding it from the politicians. We need clinics, we need decent access, we need health workers to ensure safe delivery in pregnancy, antenatal visits, and so forth. But the level of public spending has been astoundingly low. And that's been true since independence, actually. I don't understand it, because politically, it seems to me it should be an area of active engagement by the politicians. The third area of transformation is energy. And this entails both a scale up of energy services, in other words, more access to energy, and also the right kind of energy, non-fossil fuel based, renewable energy that is clean and reliable. And India, of course, suffers twice from fossil fuels, first in the climate change and second in the air pollution, which is massive. I don't know how it is in your region, but in the cities I have visited all over India, the pollution is terrible and continues to be terrible. And the estimates are that millions of people die each year from excess mortality rates attributable to the air pollution, a lot of which is attributable to fossil fuel use and industrial processes based on fossil fuels. The fourth area of investment is in sustainable land use, land conservation, and sustainable farm practices. This is another area where India has huge investments to make because much of India is suffering from falling water tables and unsustainability of the boreholes, which provide the irrigation for Haryana, Punjab, much of the Gangetic plains. So there's a big water crisis that is brewing in a lot of India, and sustainable investment in farm practices and land use is critical. The fifth area is urban infrastructure. India is rapidly urbanizing. The cities are really falling short of critical infrastructure in public transport and in water and sanitation and in other urban infrastructure necessary for sustainability of the urban setting. And the sixth area that I think is extremely important is investment in the digital economy. Here, India is showing some very innovative and pioneering aspects. And I think the private sector also, Reliance and the geophones and the other applications of Aadhaar and so forth, even with their pluses and minuses, I think has been a big advance and can be really a linchpin of smart development, because the digital technologies should allow for new kinds of services, improve government services, government transfer payments, online banking, uh, online education, online healthcare delivery, and so forth. So I personally believe that digital services have a lot to offer, but they have, of course, created a new digital divide that consciously needs to be overcome. So my work is trying to finance those 6 areas, especially in the low income countries. And there are many, many gaps and challenges to accomplishing this. First, please note that these 6 areas of investment require a mix of private and public funding, with special responsibility for public funding in health and education and key infrastructure. Private funding can come in areas like clean energy or digital connectivity, but the public funding is essential to ensure universal access because there's some very poor households and poor regions that need help. And because education and health should be regarded as public goods, not private goods. Otherwise, there's no way that there will be social justice and social inclusion. So when you think about the financing, the financial questions are to mobilize the right kinds of public and private investments. And there are failures of the financing in many, many different levels. And of course, different kinds of failures in different places. There are failures of the internal financial system that mean that lending from the private capital markets is at very high cost or not accessible by small businesses or poor households and so forth. There are fiscal policy limits that are very serious, where government cannot provide the services that are necessary. And there are international financing breakdowns. The rich countries get their capital very low cost at very low interest rates, but poor countries pay a massive premium. So the poor countries need the capital. The rich countries are capital surplus countries, but the rich countries eat up the capital. The flows are not from rich to poor, they're as much from poor to rich. And so the international capital markets do not work properly. Let me just close by saying that the work that I'm engaged in with the UN Secretary General and Deputy Secretary General is to make proposals for how the international financial architecture can be improved so that the poor countries, lower income countries, and lower middle income countries can gain access to finance, both public and private, on improved terms. And I'm going to be bringing forward some specific recommendations to the G20, which will meet in Bali in November, but then next year in India. So perhaps we can work on these issues in the coming year, because India has properly been calling on the world for financial reform, for more financial inclusion, for a more just financing of climate, because the historical responsibility is with the rich countries, but the burdens are with the poorer countries. And so these are the areas of reform that I think are extremely important. And I look to the G20 process as an area where at least there's potential breakthrough, because it's a meeting place of all of the large economies. And this year it's hosted by Indonesia, next year by India, and the year after by Brazil. So 3 years of 3 major developing countries that could really take the lead on international financial reform. Thank you for the chance to speak with you briefly today. And I'm grateful for your conference on sustainable development. And I hope that we can meet in person sometime in the coming year or so. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for your insightful thoughts.
My pleasure.
Sir, are you open to questions? 2 questions. Sir, are you open for a few questions?
I'll have to excuse myself now. So thank you very much and best wishes for your meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Now, I would like to invite our next speaker, Mr. Aziz Tayabi. Mr. Aziz Tayabi, a chartered accountant from UK, is Director, International Business Development for Baker Professional Education, responsible for the development of Baker's professional education portfolio across various international markets to help ensure candidates can maximize their chances of obtaining career-defining global professional certification most efficiently and effectively. I would like to call upon you, sir, to share some knowledge with all of us.
I do apologize, sorry. Good evening, everybody. Hope everyone's well. I'm just going to share my screen. I have a brief presentation which I'll be kind of running through. So please tell me when you can see this. Is that visible to everybody?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Wonderful. So first and foremost, I should say by saying what an absolute pleasure it is to be here, part of this conference, and delighted that IIM Bodh have taken this much needed initiative, I should say. Must say it's also an absolute honor to be here among the bastions of the sustainability world, not just in India, but very much across the world, the likes of Professor Chaks and co. Straight away, I should say, this being a virtual conference, I feel that we've all been playing our part. I calculated, I think this morning, that I saved a ton of carbon dioxide emissions by attending this from the comfort of my home. Would have been wonderful to have been there in person. I've heard so much about the IIM Bodh Gaya campus and of course the pedigree of the faculty and the students at IIM, but nonetheless, I do feel that I've done a good thing by minimizing my carbon footprint. I should also say that for my sins, my background is I studied economics. I'm an economist and I'm a chartered accountant. So unashamedly, you will have hints of that in the next 20 minutes or so. Hopefully many people in the audience here from similar backgrounds, and certainly future ambassadors for the economics and accounting profession. Because like it or not, I think we in those professions play a pivotal role in making the right choices for sustainability. And that's really the theme of what I wanted to talk about today. You probably, I'm going to start with some basic economics, right? Hopefully everyone recognizes the much loved indifference curve. And in essence, the reason I've brought this up is, from my perspective, choice is central to sustainability. And I would say actually, moreover, choice is central to taking action on sustainability. It's about, I guess, what satiates our utility and the opportunity cost of what we choose to do. And let's think that through in terms of what those opportunity costs are, those choices that we make. We've got the choice of today. What do we want to consume today, as opposed to we want to consume or the impact it's going to have tomorrow? We've got satiating our own wants and needs. Or do we think about future generations, our children, or other people who are impacted by our consumption decisions? And of course, at a more macro level, those questions that governments face, those international organizations that Professor Sachs was talking about, the economy. Do we thinking about GDP, all of those aspects, or do we put a higher value in terms of the impact of society? And of course, when you look at it at a micro level from a company perspective, how do they choose between obviously their core premise, profits versus values? And I'm sure many of the people in this forum here today might well be thinking that the choices that we would make would be more skewed towards the x-axis, the value, the society, the tomorrow, the future. But the choices are very real, they're perennial choices, and they're also daily choices. These are choices that we make, at a micro level, us as individuals, corporations, companies, but of course, at that macro level, governments, and of course, those pan-international organizations. And, we all have to accept and understand that these are very real challenges around those choices for all those consumer groups, consumers and those groups. And if you take it at an international level, and I think Professor Sachs just now just kind of alluded to this as well, it's in a sense it's easier sometimes for countries who for the last 200 years have been carbonizing the world, the atmosphere through industrialization, have moved their economies away from reliance on manufacturing, rely on other countries to do that manufacturing. And I think I'm sitting in one of those countries now here in London, UK, and then look to place rules, regulations, protocols, which can negatively impact those countries, those economies in the short term. And, individual choice, company choice, which I'll talk about a little bit more, government, country choices need global intervention and support. The list of organizations that I've just put a few names here. There are in the hundreds, and that in itself is heartening. The fact that for the last 20 years, so many of these organizations have come into being for that sole purpose of ensuring sustainability becomes a huge agenda item for governments, companies, organizations, and individuals. So that's a really heartening step that's already happened. And what's even more heartening, I believe, is government agencies coming into place, devoting, monitoring, protecting the environment as their sole responsibility, as the reason for their being. Similarly, it's like it is a huge commitment. The government departments, when they exist for that very purpose, purely for directing and setting goals in relation to sustainability. India with the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, a number of other government departments across countries around the world, really dedicated to that sole purpose. And the reason why that's so important is because it provides immediate impact through legislation. It actually helps make some of those choices, which are otherwise, very real choices, and there's natural tensions between those choices. Profits, value, society, economy, those are very, very natural, real tensions, but government intervention and legislation can play a huge part in alleviating the tension behind those choices. And just some very simple examples, just over the, many countries around the world have already, placed bans in terms of sales of diesel and petrol cars by X date, by 2030, 2040, whatever it is. Just this very week, a city in Holland, Netherlands, Haarlem, they made an announcement that they would no longer allow advertisements for beef products. Again, for sustainability, and again, two other cities in Holland, real leaders in this front in many ways, have previously announced that they will ban advertising in aviation, anything related to aviation or fossil fuels. So again, that type of action through government plays a huge part. And I just wanted to add at this point, again, that point about funding. These are all crucial, critical decisions that need to be made, but the ability for funding and investment to be channeled to those countries and those industries who are the most impacted in the short term with those, there's no denying whatever our decisions may be in terms of value, society, economy, profits, ultimately short-term economic needs have to be met and addressed. And that's really the point about this next point. Does sustainability have to pay for itself? And I just want to remind people, Thomas Malthus, we all know, his work on, or we may know his work on, population. And essentially, if you look at what, I'm sure I wouldn't put my own self in terms of the mind of such a great economist, but whether he was thinking about sustainability or not, the impact was very clear. Essentially, if the world's population grows at a faster rate than the planet's ability to produce food and other necessities, then the cost of those necessities will outweigh and outstrip the rise in wages because of that population. And then there's impact on population and whatever else, which I won't go into. That's essentially the premise of Malthus. Sustainability, for all intents and purposes. 150 years or so later, gentleman called Robert Solow, professor, very well-renowned professor, professor emeritus at MIT, Nobel Prize winner, really kind of had a completely new look at this. And the fact is, it's a counter-argument completely to Malthus, in the sense that he focused on changing levels of productivity. Essentially, what Robert Solow was saying is that if capital takes advantage of new technologies, more productive technology, it becomes more productive than old capital. And therefore, the technological and process innovation is the most powerful driver of productivity. And according to Solow, essentially, what he's saying is that humanity doesn't need to conquer new worlds and take their riches. If we invest and innovate in the right technologies, efficiencies, then we can do that within our existing context. And that's really, really important, because essentially the arguments that abound against prioritizing society, sustainability, the environment, the future environment, tend to fundamentally revolve around cost. When that cost is incurred, and how it is paid for. Government faces that reality more than anyone. If you think about it, there's a growing demand from electorates all around the world to take into account those factors, society, environment, all of those things. But at the same time, there's an equal pressure from other members of society, other members of the electorate, who are thinking, well, how is that going to pay for? I don't want to pay for that through my taxes or this or that, increased prices. So there's that constant tension which governments themselves have to face regularly, and they're at the face of that tension. So who pays for that? As I said, becomes fundamental. Is it the firm, the company itself? Is it a consumer through increased prices? Is it government through subsidies, international loans? Again, Professor Sachs talked about that critical need to be able to avail funding, capital for these type of initiatives. And what that does is it results in inaction. It results in fear. And that's what drives, as I said, not putting these things as a priority. Fear and inaction, because of the fear of cost. And there's a quote here I put here from the ex-UK Chancellor of the Exchequer. He's not the son-in-law of Mr. Murthy, is his predecessor, Mr. Philip Hammond. And essentially, this is just 2-3 years ago. And this put a lot of inaction, fear, as I've talked about, in terms of investing because of the apparent cost of getting to net zero. That's from the UK government, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Luckily, fortunately, there's so much work being done right now in terms of essentially that argument, that counter argument that Solow has put against Malthus. And I just go back to Malthus for 1 second. If Malthus was right, the world would have collapsed by now. With a population of 7+ billion, it shouldn't even be there. But thanks to technological advances that have enabled efficiencies in production, we moved on into a position where we can sustain ourselves. And we are doing a huge population. I'm not saying that there are obviously challenges with certain economies, certain countries and what have you, but generally speaking, it is possible. And essentially, I guess, this latest report, again, this report came out just this very week. I'm very conscious that We have speakers and sponsorships from Cambridge University. So I don't want to talk too much about Oxford University, but a very, very important report that came out this week. And essentially that report is saying what Solus was saying. Solo was saying that if we're able to invest in the right technologies, it's already happening. You know, the report is basically saying that through investing in the technologies and renewables, it's become there's savings of 10% per annum. So those trillions of pounds that the Chancellor of Exchequer was saying it would cost, already that's being alleviated. And the point is, what this report is saying is that further investment in green technologies are going to continue to drive costs lower and faster the more we invest in it. That's a huge message, and that's really the fundamental point about trying to alleviate those points around the fears around investment. And there are very real costs involved in switching to these technologies and all of these things. But these reports bring confidence to be able to do so, and they are very, very important. Companies that we go back to that indifference curve that we showed earlier between profits and values. I fear that there are some great companies, some great owners, CEOs, managers who have really taken on board the importance of values and balanced them with the importance of profits. This is just one example here. You may have heard of Ivan Chouinard. Again, this is again news from this very week, just yesterday, about him deciding to effectively give up ownership of his company to a charitable trust and to dedicate profits for sustainability issues. And interestingly, okay, he made this announcement yesterday. It's a big deal. It's a huge company, Patagonia, well-known brand in terms of active sportswear, those type of things. $1 billion plus company in terms of revenues. But what's interesting is he's done that now, but actually they've been putting their own values ahead of profits for years. You know, for I don't know, maybe I can't remember exactly how long, but for over 5-6 years, they've already been dedicating 1% of their sales, not their profits, their sales, to sustainability activities and supporting sustainability activities. And there's a great advert there on the right-hand side of that slide that you might see, which is something that they have put as one of their commercials. Think about, do you need to buy this product? What is the impact of you buying this product? Do you really need it? And they've also shown, you know, what it costs to make that product. So there are organizations, there are companies, there are individuals at the very top of those organizations that are making those choices of values ahead of profits, society ahead of economics, if you like. But how often is that the case? And I'm sure everybody recognizes what is probably what has been one of the most accepted and economic and business mantras. I'm sure many books at IIM Bodhgaya will probably state this very point as well, maximizing shareholder value. And that's been the purpose of business for years, decades, forever. And indeed, you know, for decades, the Business Roundtable, those faces there are from the Business Roundtable, which represents 200 of the largest companies in the US, the likes of Apple, Amazon, JP Morgan, those multinational companies that we all know of. They have repeatedly and unequivocally for the last 2 decades pronounced their adherence to that statement there as being gospel. In 2019, they met again, series of roundtable meetings, and a quite major U-turn in terms of their thinking, in terms of shareholder value no longer being everything. You have to think about other things other than shareholder value and equalizing other aspects rather than shareholder value. And all of you can see the New York Times, Washington Post, all of these major papers made a big deal about it because it is a big deal. You know, to move away from that mantra And again, placing other values at an equal footing is a huge step forward, especially from large organizations like this. And there's another quote at the top there, you might recognize it. That quote at the top there is actually from a gentleman called Jack Welch, who was the CEO of General Motors. And actually, he was probably one of the most leading exponents of that mantra in terms of maximizing shareholder value being everything. And he himself, post his retirement, post the financial crisis, realized, had an epiphany moment in terms of actually perhaps that was not the case. It shouldn't be the case. And just this is, you know, a very, very, very well-renowned analyst. He was speaking about, you know, the outcomes from that business roundtable. And I just want to emphasize, I just highlighted there, as you can see in bold, some really important words: employees, customers, suppliers, community, environment. And the most important of them all, I think, is that equal billing. And that to come from, you know, those organizations shows the importance of choosing society as well as economics profits. And it's not a new view, right? You know, in any ways, it echoes, represents a view that was held in the 50s and 60s in what was called managerial capitalism. It's not something new, but I think we should also be absolutely candid. And this is not a U-turn or an about turn in thinking. It's not due to some Bodhi enlightenment moment that these CEOs have been through. And I appreciate that, obviously, you know, the campus is so clear to so close to one of the most important epiphany moments, enlightenment moments. But this has come about from a commercial understanding and growing recognition that there is a new generation of consumers, there's a new generation of employees who don't want to work, who will not buy from or do business with companies who do not believe, who they believe are not socially responsible. And that in itself is a huge, I mean, it's such a great moment if you think about it, that they've taken that from us as individuals, have forced them into thinking like this. Our thoughts, our decisions, and I think social media has played a huge part in this. You know, if the effect of improving norms of behavior through social media, and even at companies the likes of Facebook, huge companies with thousands and millions, thousands of employees, biggest companies in the world, Facebook, Disney, Uber, Walmart, Amazon, all of these companies have taken heed of this. I just say the Washington Post, where Stephen Pearlstein works for, obviously is owned by Jeff Bezos, so I'm sure that's not a coincidence as well. But as I said earlier, you know, my background is I am a chartered accountant by profession. And so speaking from experience, you know, one of the important ways, one of the fundamental ways that a company is able to communicate their views on what's important to them is corporate reporting, investor relations, all of those things. Corporate reporting is absolutely central to it. And I've seen that firsthand in terms of how corporate reporting has changed for those companies, all large companies. You know, there was a time when the reporting on the environment was a paragraph in the annual statement or the corporate report of companies. And that's evolved into being companies having their own dedicated separate ESG report. And then now, even more importantly, is the integration of ESG, people, planet, profit, all of those things into one report and putting everything side by side such that there is essentially a triple bottom line, taking into account, measuring, explaining the value of these different aspects of what a company does, measuring them and putting them side by side along with a balance sheet, along with sales, along with revenue, along with profit, and along with loss. And I think the future of accountants, hopefully many here today, I'm sure, they'll be well placed to think about specializing in these areas. It is very much the future. It should be their goal. It should be the goal, a sustainability goal, even for IIM Bodh, to make sure that they have a responsibility to make sure that their students are well versed in terms of these different aspects of corporate reporting, integrated reporting, and that the research that's done here at the IIM is also looks at the value of such reporting, enhancing its effectiveness, ensuring its adoption as being a priority. And I think IIM plays a huge role in that. And major fund holders, fund managers, large institutional investors, us as individuals are making investment decisions on companies and on the company's views on the environment, governance, society, and how they are managing it. The notion of sustainability has been adopted now by organizations, all major organizations around the world. And even here in India, we talk about our CSR reporting and, investment in CSR that's also come about. And that kind of leads me on to my next points, which, everyone I hope recognizes these pictures. Our beloved Yamuna River, such an integral part of India, beauty, splendor, one of the wonders of India. We should be celebrating this at all times. The unfortunate reality is, the tragedy, if you like, is increasingly that Yamuna River is being recognized as one of the most polluted rivers in India, in the world. And in a sense, it therefore epitomizes the challenge, the environmental challenges in India. It epitomizes also the dilemma about choice, the dilemma that companies and organizations have. There's so many factories along the banks of the river, in the vicinity of the river, polluting, contaminating that river, and as well as the visual impact, the real impact in terms of lives, the thousands of people that are affected in terms of water source, nutrition, farming, all of those things. And it took in the end, legislation, the work that was done by the Human Rights Commission, forced notice and action on the factories that were there. They had to shut down factories. They had to relook at how their production and their emissions. Ultimately, what did it do? Ultimately, those same companies where profit was the be all and end all, their sole thinking, ultimately got hit economically and through their profits. And also, the brand impact of being one of those organizations, when people now start to care about these things, what you're doing there, it impacts your business. It has economic losses on that front as well. So, companies will and still ultimately have to think about the economics and the profits, right? But in a roundabout way, if there's preventative and punitive legislation in place, it makes them think about those impacts also then can be included in their economic and profit thinking, essentially. So these might not be value-based decisions and choices that the company is making, but they have to realize that there is an economic consequence and impact of them. Through those penalties, fines, loss of business, through brand and consumer behavior and those type of things. And they'll need to make commercial decisions as a result of that. And, simple, straightforward decisions in a sense, do I then go ahead and build my power plant next to a river or in a forested area. And these are like fundamental economic concepts. And I'm sure many people in this room will ultimately do research and theses on things like this, which is already happening. You know, that concepts of, you know, willingness to pay versus willingness to accept. A lot of research being done on it, and I urge that you know, people here continue to do that research. So again, to sum up on that, penalties and fines, legislation, I should say, plays a critical part. You know, governments have to play that role, because ultimately companies are necessarily, to some extent, going to have a short-term myopic bias. There are those exceptions that we talked about. There's no doubt about it, but the reality is the majority of them need a little bit of a stick as well. And that's where governments play a really, really important role. I just wanted to kind of, I guess, conclude a little bit here. Bodh Gaya already holds such a unique significance in the history of the world. And I think by choosing Bodh Gaya, you know, IIM played a significant role in continuing the sustainable prosperity and development of this most wondrous of cities. You know, the ecosystem that builds up around a university and campus such as IIM, such as the one that IIM have constructed, cannot be lost. You know, you're getting a new and highly educated student base for the city, for the wider India, for the world. Businesses grow to cater for those students, for the faculty, for the delegations that are constantly going to be attending, attracting corporates to invest in offices, knowing that they have the ready talent here in Bodh Gaya itself, new and modern schools, education, infrastructure for young families, healthcare, supporting growth populations. So all of these things kind of, and health and education, of course, a healthy and education population is so important for this as the basis of a sustainable future. So that's how I'd like to finish. You know, of course, you know, IIM themselves, I should say, you know, at the top of the education world, the top table of the education world, incorporating sustainability thinking into your curriculum, modernizing those age-old subjects like economics, commerce, accounting, management, specifically creating courses and research on the advancement of critical theories in ESG, sustainability, disseminating the latest thoughts from global experts, certainly not me, by hosting events like today and conferences like today. You know, I feel very blessed, one, to work for an organization that I work for, Becca, who place diversity, inclusion, ESG as core values and invested a huge amount of time and effort in terms of developing continued professional education and learning courses in those areas. It's the heart of our values, and I'm very proud to have been invited here today to partake in this conference, and I wish everyone a wonderful day. I'm sure you've learned much, and many thanks again to IIM, one, for the kind invitation to myself, and for putting on this fantastic conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for sharing your knowledge with us. We are really grateful to Becca Professional Education for sponsoring the conference and helping us to make this a successful one. Sir, would you like to take a few questions? Hello. Sir, am I audible?
I can, yeah, I can take, I have a few minutes for sure. My pleasure.
Okay, so anyone, if you want to ask any question, then go ahead.
Sir, I have a small question.
Thank you. Hi. Hello. Good
Hello,
evening.
hello, sir. Good evening, sir. Sir, I was listening to you. I'm Diljit. I'm from Delhi, Delhi University. So some of my work is related to renewable energy, solar energy. And solar energy is picking up very fast. India is leading in renewable energy, one of the most leading countries in the world. But in solar energy, the rooftop solar energy, the domestic sector, the domestic segment has not been picking up very well. So, do you think that you were talking about legal measures to be taken in order to encourage in certain aspects? So, do you think legal measures, if they are taken, that could help in helping the solar rooftop in the domestic segment to come up in India?
I think as much as legal in this aspect, pleased to meet you, Ms. Daljit, ma'am. I would say it's a mixture of legislation and also subsidies. I think that's where government can play a better role. And certainly here in the UK, where we don't have much sun, solar energy doesn't work too well. But nonetheless, there was for quite a long time very considerable support, subsidization for the installation of things like you're describing there, those rooftop solar panels and those type of things. So I think there, subsidization, that type of encouragement is probably, I suspect, would be more fruitful than a legislative side. So that's my personal view on that at this moment in time.
Thank you very much.
So much, sir, for your time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Nice,
Thank you,
nice
everyone.
hearing you, Aziz. And this is Vinita Sahai, Director, Ryan Bodhgaya. And I'm very thankful to you for having taken out your time. But there's one question which has always bothered me, that when we talk of sustainability, India and all these ancient economies, if I can use the word, we've been always living the life in a pretty sustainable way. Perhaps that's the reason that planet Earth has sustained for so long. And the modern civilizations have much to blame, but when it comes to paying up the costs, it is these developing economies that end up paying much more than the culprits who've been responsible for creating this mess. So, do you think it's fair, and what are your views on it?
No, exactly right. And as I mentioned myself, that is really where international organizations, the World Bank with their International Development Association, those type of organizations have to play a critical role. And the G20 that was mentioned earlier, because they include the likes of India and those other really robust developing, they're not developing anymore. Sorry, I hate to use that word in the context of an India and a Brazil and an Indonesia. There's no such thing as developing in those contexts. But you're right, the reality is that it's not, I think it's really about those economies which still depend so highly in terms of manufacturing production right now. And it's how do we bring them, one, access to capital at the right rate, exactly as Professor Sachs was talking about. That's the critical thing. That's where the organizations like the IMF and World Bank have to be held to account to make sure that, they're also getting the same privileges, as you like, as some of the other more developed economies. And that can be done. And I think the fact that by doing this, if everyone buys into the concept that reducing certain types of ways of doing business and concentrating on the environment has a global impact and benefits people globally, then they're willing to invest in it and willing to forego certain things. And I'm talking about those other major economies around the world right now. So access to capital at the right rates is very important. And also that almost sometimes bilateral support from country to country. When you're doing trade deals between the UK and India, or the US and India, to also factor in the support to support that transition of the economy from, that production-led to a more sustainable, technologically led environment. So I think those pan international organizations that we need to talk about, that we talked about, have to play a really important role, but also bilateral engagement when we just, so not to just talk about trade, but to inbuild these aspects, sustainability and, you know, financial support to wean countries away from their reliance is important. It's not, I'm not saying that's an easy answer and there's a panacea for it, which of course there isn't. But I think, I do genuinely believe that, you know, people now, politicians now know that it is important to their electorate and they're putting it high on their agenda, which means that they will make the sacrifices that need to be made for the long term.
Good. And I hope that we'll be able to host you one day physically in our campus, and you're an open invitation to you to visit our country in our campus.
Very kind. I would, it would be my absolute pleasure, as I said. Thank you so much again just for being here today with such a, you know, fantastic panel and audience. Congratulations to you again for putting this together. And I really do hope so that in the near future that we meet in person, and importantly, as importantly, you know, that Becca can support many other initiatives that IIM Bodh Gaya are looking to do, both on sustainability and education and learning in general. I look forward to it.
We look forward to collaborating with you more.
Thank you very much. Best of luck, everyone. Enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Director Ma'am. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Good day. Good evening.
I would like to thank all our esteemed guests who spared their valuable time and decided to be with us today. I would also like to thank all the participants and audience for being cooperative and so patient. With this, we come to an end of day one of the conference. We will meet again tomorrow with a renewed spirit and start day two of the conference at 9 a.m. Thank you, everyone.
The recording has stopped.